we got somebody in to help us do it. Somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, Michael, instead of you and I, right?
Yeah.
We've got Peter Kiernan, former senior partner over at Goldman Sachs. He doesn't look like a vampire squid, though, to me, you know?
Those
He
are the
really
old
doesn't.
days.
Best-selling author of the book American Mojo, Lost and Found, Restoring Our Middle Class Before the World Blows By. It is a best-selling book with good reason. It is exactly what is on so many people's minds today. Peter, welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks very much.
It's fun to have you. So let's start out with the content of the book. What has happened to the middle class, and why has it happened?
Well, the middle class went from being a kind of a block of granite. It was easy to identify. It was largely white. You could tell what people earned. And then in the 70s, we started to lose some of that momentum.
Why?
Well, it started with a couple of commodity crises, the gold crisis and the oil crisis. But then something happened, which was a disconnect. From 1970, well, they call it 1948 to 73, productivity doubled. And wages did too. Then from 1973 to 2008, productivity doubled again, but wages essentially stayed flat. Now, another thing happened to cause a problem, because wages staying flat on its own is not great, but it's not the sole problem. We talk a lot about inflation, and it moderated after the Reagan years, but relevant inflation, what I call in my book relevant inflation, the cost of being a member of the middle class was much, much higher than normative inflation. What do I mean by relevant inflation? A house, a car, educating your kids, health care, retirement. Oh, yes, and one more thing, which was the belief that your kids would be better off than you are. All those things. That
really is what seems to have always defined the middle class, that belief.
That aspiration. I think it's much better than, there are a lot of demographic texts that will talk about what you earn and what your education was. I think aspirations is the best way to measure it. Now, what happened was, as you saw this greater and greater gap between real wages, which were going nowhere, and this inflation for relevant costs going up, families all over the country said, what can we do? It's slipping away from us. So the first thing they put mom to work. So during the 50s, 70% of the households had stay-at-home moms. That's now totally reversed. And for a while that worked, but the relevant inflation kept climbing and wages stayed flat. And so families were in more and more dire straits. What can we do? How can we solve this problem? And then, like a bolt of light, it occurred to them. Borrow. In 1957, there weren't a handful of credit cards. In 1967, there were 1 billion credit cards. You know, we've basically exploded. Excuse me. It took until 2007 to get 1 billion credit cards, but we exploded. And by 2008, consumer debts stood at just under $13 trillion at a peak. And then the axe just fell. And so what happened was whole members of the middle class, the black middle class, rechased a generation of progress. And so the average black middle class family is talking about net worth of $5,000. And same thing with Hispanic. And so what happened was the middle class split into many pieces. So you look today, there are about 45 million poor people in this country. That's entirely too many. But just above that seam of the poverty line are another 50 million Americans, what I call in the book hovering poor.
Right.
Just a twist of life's knife away from an experience in poverty. And so what's happened is that we have old tools and old social service mechanisms trying to deal with a totally new problem, which is it used to be that you have social services, just get people above the poverty line and they'll be fine. That's no longer sufficient. And since the crash in 2008, things like the minimum wage worker, the number of minimum wage workers has surged as that unemployment rate has come down. It's up fourfold. And so the nature of our workforce has changed. All these things compound to creating real problems for the middle class, and we've got to come up with specific solutions in order to solve their problems.
So you really do seem to attach the real change to the inability to keep income rising along with inflation, right? The stagnation.
Yes, there are ways to do it, but frankly, the best way to measure it is that gap.
What I want to ask you, though, is how did that happen? What caused incomes to stop keeping up?
Well, I would say the first thing is that when you take companies and you allow them to disconnect and disengage from the United States and move jobs offshore with no friction or penalty of any kind, you basically remove the linkage between a corporate need and a corporate ambition and what's good for the nation. Once that happens, offshoring becomes really, really powerful in terms of cutting the ability of companies to pay and of middle-class families to keep up. And so it became okay to just pay less and less and less on a real basis. And what happened was, if you think about it, from 1973 to 2008, productivity doubled. And real wages only went up about 4%. Where did the rest of that money go?
Interesting.
Into the hands of the 1%, into the hands of the corporations, and a heck of a lot of it went overseas. And so we forced a lot of the great jobs overseas. Now, if you look at China, China's picked up 10 million manufacturing jobs since 1984, and we've lost about 6 million. This has literally been a transference of wealth out of our nation, and we really haven't managed or thought about it very carefully. And unless we do, we're going to have a middle class that becomes increasingly disconnected. And the trouble is, Rick, if you have very few rich who are getting richer and richer, and a lot of poor who are getting poorer and poorer, and nothing of strength in between, history is not kind to that construct. Over and over, that construct has failed. It's collapsed. So this isn't just a nice to have. This is a necessity for, I have kids, for my kids. We have to solve this problem. This is as important as anything we face as a nation. I think most of the people who are running for office know that.
Michael?
I got nothing. I'm so depressed.
No, I think there's great opportunity.
I'm like, okay, I'm going to sell what I got and go back to the Hermitage. No,
Michael, stay with me, man. There's a way out of this. I promise.
Tell us the way out of this.
That's where I wanted to get to, because I knew this was going to that space. I was actually just focused on the title of your best-selling book, Becoming China's Bitch, and I do want to talk about that. So what is the pathway forward? Number one. Number two, sort of as a backdrop to that question, I was having a conversation last time I was in New York with a couple of current and former Wall Streeters, and it was talk about a scary conversation. They were very much speaking to what you were just saying about this divide that's growing. There is no more middle class in America. You either have cash or you're poor. And that's just kind of where the model seems to be settling.
In other words, we're Mexico.
Okay.
It's a dangerous place to head towards.
It's a dangerous place to be. But to make matters more complicated and some would say worse, a couple of them were specifically citing that given what's going on, this is why you have a lot of conservatives sort of fixating on the Fed the way they do, that given what's going on right now, that there is this, to get out of this situation, we're looking at this country with $19 trillion, worth of debt. How do you begin to pay that off, was my question. And their answer was basically you convert it to cash. And in the process of doing that, you basically create a great deal of inflation. And so since the Fed has been talking at the end of last year and certainly more recently about, increasing interest rates and not really sort of digging into the inflationary impact of that. How is that the way forward here to really kind of create this off-ramp by what the Fed is saying, or are there other solutions that we should be looking at that will help us avoid, further weighting down the middle class with high inflation?
Well, what I love about this show is that they're thinking questions like that. Don't you think we've ridden this Fed horse just about as hard as poor old Flicka can go? I think beating the Fed up is not the way to go here. There are two things we have to look at, in my opinion. One is outside our country, and the other is inside. Look at outside. Outside our country, the OECD predicts that in the next 10 years, 1 billion new members of the world's middle class will be created. And in the next 10 years after that, 1 billion more. So in 20 years, that's 2 billion members of the middle class in the world who are not there today. That's 10 times more members of the middle class. Now, people could say, oh my God, that's a gigantic threat. there's going to be a middle class. And in fact, writing this book, I went to dozens of countries that have as a centerpiece of their strategy, of their country strategy, the care and nurturing and creation of a strong middle class, taking, in many cases, pages directly from our book. So they're doing the same things that we did in the 50s and 60s, they're doing in these countries, and they're creating a strong middle class. However, who, better than the United States, knows the wants and needs and services and products that this emerging middle class needs, whether it's financial services or medical devices or anything among the 100 great brands that we have. And if you look at the 100 biggest brands in the world, 80% of them come from the United States. I'll give you just one small example of the kind of opportunity we have. This is the greatest new business opportunity the world has ever seen. If you take all of Asia except Japan, they currently spend less than 4% of their GDP on healthcare. Now, as you know, we're spending 5 times that and growing.
Right.
Now, if I know one thing for sure, if I'm an engineer in India or a business person in China and I'm starting to make a few bucks, one of the first things I'm going to want for myself, for my family, for my wife, for my kids, for my parents, is quality health care. I'm going to think twice about buying infant formula from some non-branded company that cuts it with God knows what powders. Right. I'm going to buy the U.S. brand. I'm going to buy the U.S.-style health care. We have the healthcare service system that's the envy of the world. Similarly, our financial services and payments, I was meeting with some people in Iran talking about how credit cards work. They said, oh, my God, what a fabulous concept. You don't have to carry around cash all the time. You can just give a card and they don't have to check your bank account. They'll just, quote, lend you the money.
You still got to pay the bill.
You still got to pay the bill.
Until they solve that problem, I don't know if it's all it's cut out to be.
Well, I have to say that credit cards are a problem, but our financial services is another exportable good.
Right.
And what you have is, right now, 80% of the growth economically is outside our borders. 95% of the purchasing power is outside our border. And 97% of the consumers is outside our border.
But that's a problem, isn't it? I mean, you could look at that as a positive situation. I don't, and I'll tell you why. Because the only way that we can deal with structural unemployment, which is very much in our future, there's no getting around it. The only way you can motivate companies to deal with that, and it has to be companies, government can't fix that. The only way you can get them to do that is to convince them that if they don't find a way around the problem, they're not going to have any consumers. If they are able to continue to say, well, I don't really care if I have American consumers because 95% of the consumers are outside of the country, we're in big trouble.
Rick, that comment, it's like that movie that completes me, okay? That is exactly, I have a whole section of the book on structural unemployment. That's where we are. And so if you look at what's going on in the home game, right here, we're doing some things, I'm happy to talk about it, like increasing the minimum wage. We've done it 7 times since Reagan. Let's do it the 8th.
So you feel good about what we're seeing in New York and
I think it's
California.
necessary, but nowhere near sufficient. It will move some people. Remember, we've had a surge in minimum wage unemployment since 2008. But it'll help other people. It'll help people in unions. Some unions are tied to a step up. If there is an increase in minimum wage, they step up. It'll also help in another way that people don't typically like to talk about, but it's the kind of thing you can say on this show. Companies that have a penchant for paying rock bottom wages look to the rest of us to subsidize them.
Yes.
That we provide a safety net, a healthcare net, a food net. I'm involved with Robin Hood, as you know. We're the largest provider of food services and money to food services in the city. People rely on that. They delegate that to us. I think society has to be a little bit better tax collector than that. We can't let someone who's running a bar or a restaurant.
We should all have stock in Walmart because you and I are paying their employee benefits.
There are many, many companies out there that basically rely on our goodwill. Now, listen, there are public goods like roads and military and schools we're all willing to pay for. But how much do we subsidize someone who has a proclivity to pay rock bottom wages so their people are basically hungry, knowing that we're going to bail them out? We're going to feed their kids, and we're going to feed them, and we're going to give them housing and all that stuff. But I think there's a bigger issue. So many people focus on this jobs report that comes out every month. And the 2 most important ingredients are left out. And this is the opportunity for the big corporations. Right now, the thing number one they leave out is we're creating jobs, but we don't talk about the market value of the job. A job is not a job is not a job. I read that BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics report every month. It talks about retail and hospitality and entertainment and restaurant. And so it doesn't measure the jobs we're creating. Right now, today, in this country, there are 4 million breadwinner, skill-based jobs that are available. They don't require the genius of job creation. They need to be filled. And the trouble is
we don't have the skilled
we don't have the skilled employees to do it. And if you go to country after country, they are saying, we're sending our young people to train with you. They're going to Caltech Berkeley, they're going to MIT, they're going to University of Chicago, getting degrees, and just when they're ready is, perfectly trained engineers, and we've subsidized them. What's the first thing we say to those people? Go home.
Go home.
Now, the problem with that is that these are people who could help fill some of these 4 million jobs, and these 4 million jobs are multiplier jobs, Rick. They are the kind of job where if I hire one software engineer, I got to hire 3 other people to help that person. Right. So those 4 million jobs could be 12 million jobs. But the best part is they're better jobs than the minimum wage jobs we're talking about because they're breadwinner jobs. You can raise a family. You can be part of the middle class. Oh, and by the way, if you're a company that has that, you can gain an advantage over your competition. We have been singularly incapable of getting business and government to work together. I think since 2008, government's basically said business's brand is broken. And business has not been sophisticated enough about tying the two things together. You're not going to solve a problem like this, just as you say, a structural unemployment problem, without business and government working much more closely together.
Now you're completing me. Because that is exactly what I want to get into.
Mike,
next.
Aren't you glad you weren't
Let's
here?
do this. Can you hang around with us?
I got nothing.
We're talking with Peter Kernan, the author of American Mojo, Lost and Found, a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. We are going to return, and Peter is going to stay with us, and we're going to keep talking about this stuff. Like I said, he just hit on my favorite topic. So we'll get going on that. You're listening to Steele and Ungar here on Sirius XM POTUS 124. This is the home of Rational Radio. We have been talking with Peter Kernan, author of a fantastic book on the middle class called American Mojo, Lost and Found, Restoring Our Middle Class Before the World Blows By.
Hey, Peter, before you do that, I want to dovetail for Peter. So I guess you must be, turning on a lot of light bulbs out there, because a friend of mine who is the executive director of the California Community Action Partnership Association just sent me a text. He said, "This guy is awesome." You've got to connect me. His brief comments on poverty and middle class were incredibly insightful, and I have a great deal of respect for the Reverend John Heath, who is the executive director of the California Community Action Partnership.
We'll
we would love to have you come out. We'll hook you up. So you've got a friend out west.
I was about to say, thank you, Mom.
Right. Reverend Heath is one of these guys, worked in our administration here in Maryland. Real grassroots guy. So if you're clicking with him, I guess you must be clicking.
You must be on it. Well, we're glad Reverend Heath is listening. We should say that.
Absolutely.
So listen, when we left off our discussion, you had mentioned the problems of business getting all of this. And we were talking during the break, and I said one of my biggest concerns is that business, for all the reasons we understand, plus another layer we'll get to in a minute, which is called shareholders, business has a tendency to do what's going to improve their numbers this year. If it's a public company, it's going to do what it feels it needs to do to increase its numbers this quarter, just as long as they get that 10% improvement every year. So how do you persuade business? Because it's not really going to be government. How do you persuade business to take the steps that they need to take in order to assist in training a workforce that they can continue to employ so that we keep those people as consumers in our consumer-driven economy?
Sure, it's a great question. And one of the things that has happened for both sides running for office, not just this campaign, is that there are a couple of elephants in the room that people have not been willing to talk about. I'd like to wrestle one of them at least.
Oh.
So
I've wrestled
imagine
elephants.
In your mind,
be careful.
Imagine in your mind.
Anybody we know?
Wrong kind of elephants. Wrestle tigers. Sorry, Mike. Imagine in your mind every living soul in the city of Los Angeles, every man, woman, and child, that huge assemblage. and add to it every man, woman, and child living in Philadelphia. All those people. That's how many people there are in this country between the ages of 16 and 25 who are what I call in my book NEETs, not in employment, education, or training. They've got nothing to do. If you go just a few miles from here to the DeKalb Avenue exit after school, you will see dozens of young people hanging out. That's an after-school program that's going nowhere. So imagine being 23 years old. You've dropped out of school 5 years ago. You don't read at grade level. You don't do math at grade level. You have nothing in terms of options. There is no one who wants you. That is a $100 billion a year anchor on the middle class. And we wind up incarcerating way too many of them. And that doesn't get you a better citizen or a trained person as a result.
Just warehouses.
It just gets them out of society for a little while. Then they come back and the recidivism is very high. But getting the corporations of America to say, okay, let's look at these NEETs and figure out what to do with them. Because they're not all. I spoke to a bankers convention not long ago, and somebody said, well, if you gave them jobs, they wouldn't take it. I said, look, I'll cop. We're talking about 6.5 million people. I'll cop that 2 or 3 million may not want to work. But there are in this city, in New York City, and in Washington, and in Baltimore, and in Los Angeles, thousands and thousands of kids who are graduating high school with A averages. They've done exactly what we want them to do. And what do they get? Is it a bridge to somewhere or a pier? They get to the end. They're 18 years old. If you're in New York and if you're in one of the homes, you're kicked out because you're 18. You can't stay anymore, so you can't be in that kind of care. But there are many, many kids who are 18 who are with A averages that don't have a place to go. I think we have to provide and get the corporations to provide some sort of youth guarantee. It doesn't have to be all youth, but you can't have 50% black unemployment rates in the center city and tell me that, oh my gosh, that sounds like the unemployment rate of Molenbeek. You ask not who for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for you. If you have that problem over there and it leads to the kind of
and
problem,
for anybody who may not be aware, Molenbeek is the part of Brussels where a lot of the terrorism has arisen from.
And we're creating petri dishes for dissatisfaction. And the truth is, if you amass all of our this is our seed corn for the next middle class. These millennials are sparkling with energy and ideas. If you go out to the West Coast and you talk to them, people say they don't have great ideas. They have phenomenally great ideas. They're ready to disrupt. They want to Uber everything. They want to basically have, Airbnb where they can essentially set up their life either just in time or they can orchestrate it or all these things. And what are we doing for these young people? We have a crisis in junior college completion. Now, I went through and looked in. If you look at the part-time students at junior college in this country, and you think about all those kids, the part-time ones, that's a 2-year program. In 4 years, you know what percentage don't make it? 92%. Can you imagine a situation? 70% of the kids who graduate from high school go on to something else, a junior college, a training opportunity, or college, and a great many do not complete. Sometimes it's money. But if you talk to CCNY, City College of New York, they say, the kids coming out of the public schools, 75% need additional remedial help in order to do the work. What we've lost is the ability to manage these young people at the adjacencies. And so I've forgotten what the rate is, but the guidance counselor to student rate in New York City schools is something like 1 to several hundred. Now, what kind of way is that to manage the growth? When we were coming along, if you dropped out of high school 25 years ago, you could make it. There was a way you could make it. Right. Today, you've got no shot. And so if you're – sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Now you have no shot because what's required of you in terms of skill sets, we won't even deal with the education piece. I mean, that you're handicapped from that start right out of the box. I mean, at least – back in the day, there were some basics that were in place. You didn't have the level of incomplete education. In other words, having a kid go into 9th grade at a 5th grade or a 6th grade level. That was not the reality, at least not to the same degree that it is today. But that's step one. Step two, what is that person going to walk into? What kind of marketplace are they walking into? They're going to be required to have certain skill sets because we're not manufacturing the way we once did. We're not building products here at home the way we once did. So the kid who could actually to build something or create something with his hand, that space is occupied now by a machine, and he needs to know how to do code and programming for that machine, not build the product. True?
I'll tell you, it's totally true. And every once in a while, I get gobsmacked by that point. And I'll give you an example. Through Robin Hood, we were involved in a charter school up in the South Bronx, real tough area. And the kids were hanging out after school way into the evening, even on a cold fall evening, saying, what are these kids doing up there? So we sent somebody up there, and we learned they were hanging out up there because it was the only place in the they could get Wi-Fi.
Oh, really?
That's right.
That we have a digital divide, and it used to be, why can't Johnny read? And now it's going to be, why can't Johnny
Get
decode?
online, yeah.
We have got to as a matter of economic necessity, competitive necessity, not just here. I mean, even if we're going to feed those opportunities outside our borders, we've got to have the requisite skills here, because there isn't enough economic growth here to feed our middle class to solve that problem. And there are things we've starved, all kinds of infrastructure things we've starved for generations now, postponing. And as new ones come up, Michael, you're spot on. Things like providing Wi-Fi, it ought to be as universal as reading.
Well, it is elsewhere around the globe. I mean, you know, it still boggles my mind. Since Al Gore invented the internet, you'd think we at least here at home would have free Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
I mean, Bernie Sanders wants us to have a free education. Let's start with free Wi-Fi, because that's how people are connected. That is the new learning space.
I agree with that.
Than more than anything else. And yet, you know, you've got in poor communities, people making the sacrifice now, you know, so that their kids can be somewhat connected because they want them to make it in high school. Oh, by the way, the high school is running 54K and not you know the latest in high speed internet. But here's the situation. I mean, you go around the country, and you go into these classrooms, you go into these buildings, the environment in which our kids are learning, and all of this translates into the job market. And that's the part that people, for me, don't seem to get. When a child is sitting in a classroom with a leaky ceiling and half the lights in the classroom don't work, and oh, by the way, the library only has 6 computers for a school of 1,500 kids, that's the real life for these kids. And you wonder why by the time they get to 10th grade or 11th grade, they're like, screw this crap. You know, why am I going to come and sit in this space every day and listen to someone who doesn't want to be here to begin with because the work conditions are so poor? Now, some people say, well, you're exaggerating. No, that's currently the public school
really
system
how it is.
in a lot of urban communities around the country.
That's not exaggerating.
And so what I would say to guys, and I'd be curious to your point on this connection, what I emphasize when I talk to business owners is I remind them of one very prudent and important fact, that this September, a 5-year-old is going to enter kindergarten somewhere and in their community. And in 13 very, very short years, she's going to graduate from high school, presumably, and she's going to knock on your door looking for a job. Are you prepared for that? And the answer is largely no. It's not that they don't want to be, it's that they're not allowed to be, because we bifurcate, we disconnect our business community, the entrepreneurs out there who are going to create the jobs, from the workforce. And is there a bridge that we should be building there? I think there is. I'd be curious as to whether or not you think there is.
The phrase I've been using, the answer is yes, I do. And the phrase I've been using is, we have to look at this as a talent management problem.
Yes, thank you.
And so here's an example. In the next decade, we're going to create 1.5 million computer services jobs. No country on the planet is going to come close.
Yeah.
So how are we doing on the talent management side? Well, if you look at the colleges and universities, they're graduating about 40,000 computer science graduates a year. So if you go up 10 years, that means we're going to be something like 700,000 or 800,000 people short. And these are great middle-class jobs. There's no minimum wage around computer science. What we have to do is look backward and say, how are we doing in managing our talent? Why is it, for example, that 8% of our graduates from college are science, technology, and engineering and math, STEM? And China, 30% are science, technology, engineering, and math. It's because at an early age, if you have talent there, there's intervention They guide you. It's a controlled economy, which has its shortcomings. But if somebody has talent, they will guide them.
Find it and put you in
and they
that
will
direction.
put you, and they will give you a sense of what is possible for you. What country in the world allows so many people to graduate college and in their senior year they say, gee, what am I going to do next year? And no one has worked. You would never coach a team like that. This talent management issue is so profound. And it goes really deep because we have a youth employment problem in this country. And anybody running for president, I don't care, Democrat, Republican, or somewhere in between, who isn't facing the youth unemployment issue is missing the key fault. Now, here's something people say. Can I just continue? Yeah. Everyone says, well, education's the answer. Education's the answer. And while it obviously is, and I believe it because I've been very involved with charter schools and other things in the city, I want to take you back to the imagination, okay? Imagine every person in the city of Dallas, Texas. All those people. That's how many people, when the school bell rings today, and school ends, the door is open from the school, and that's how many young kids are walking out with no home to go to. They're walking out to their car. They're walking out to their shelter. They're walking out to their tent or wherever it is they're trying to sleep. They're food insecure. They're housing insecure. By most yardsticks, they're twice as likely to be abused and 3 times as likely to be incarcerated. So if you got 1.25 million kids like that, just how good does your teacher have to be? We have 4 million K through 12 teachers in this country, and I think that's an army of excellence for us. But they have these kids for 8 hours. What about the other 16? And so what's happening is corporations, in my opinion, and the government are confusing an expense with investment. If you look at it as an expense, it's the kind of thing you can forego. If you look at it as an investment in creating the kind of people infrastructure, human capital necessary to drive your business, you look at it differently. You don't look at it as one of these unnecessary aggravations. And there are lots of ways you can help.
See, you identify it very well, in my opinion. My concern is that we know that government's inefficient. So to place any bet on government getting this the way that they should makes me nervous. Some of it can be done. So I look more closely. I sound like a Republican right now, I realize, but it's just real. I look more closely at the corporations. My concern is that corporations, the way they are built today, and Michael knows I've made the correlation to income inequality and stagnation beginning very much around the time when companies decided to go to the public markets to raise money. And shareholders came into the picture and took the place of the worker in the chain of importance. I think that ties together. So you look at it today, you've got shareholders saying, yeah, that all sounds swell, everything you just said. But what's my dividend going to be this year? How much is the stock price going to improve this year? Because if you start spending money and you damage our numbers because you're looking to the future, I'm not going to be in this stock in the future.
Right. Look, having served on boards, there are a lot of things that we do without recognizing it that force business policy. I think if you have the highest tax rates in the world, that becomes an industrial policy. You force people to look at inversion and other things. What we have to do is begin to make this something that is beneficial to the shareholders. And the way to do it is explain that there are simple things. You don't have to take somebody just from the ground, but deliberately hire someone who is one of these who needs some training. Well, a lot of corporations have rules that they won't interview somebody for a job unless they already have a job. Yeah. Well, that's part of the jobless problem in the first place. Deliberately hire somebody who doesn't have a job. Deliberately hire some out-of-work machinist from Flint, Michigan.
Do you get them to do it?
Yeah,
can I hold it there because we're going to keep it, Peter. We're not letting you leave, man. Okay. You good for the rest of the hour?
I'm good for as long as you want.
I got to tell you, I'm seeing it from the Twitter, man. They're loving what you're saying.
Okay, well,
you're really educating people. We are coming right back with Peter Kiernan, who is indeed the author of the national bestseller, American Mojo, Lost and Found. And if you've been listening, you should understand why his book is doing so well. Steele and Ungar, Sirius XM POTUS 124, the home of rational radio and a very smart economist. We have been having what I think has been an absolutely fascinating conversation with Peter Kiernan, author of American Mojo, Lost and Found. We're going to let you in on it. If you'd like to call in, we'll see if we can't get you into the conversation with Peter. He has brought up any number of issues that we could talk about for the next week. 866-967-6887. Peter, I want to pick up on the thread that we were talking about before we took off for a second. Business. You know, as you and I, again, were talking during the break, and you basically set up very nicely, I thought, that there's a role in dealing with all of this for government and for business. Government, as I noted, we all know government is inefficient. It doesn't operate for a profit. Therefore, by definition, it's likely to be inefficient. And they have not been the best when it comes to training. They have 9,000 programs that all overlap each other and nothing seems to get done. So the government can do some of these things. They can raise minimum wages, which helps. Doesn't take it, as you've said, far enough, but it helps. But you do need business to play their role in this. In the age of shareholder importance in business, in the age of everything to get your numbers as good as you can get them, either for the quarter or for the year, how do you get business to do what they need to do their part to solve this problem? And should they care?
They should care. And first, I think there are a couple of different ways to look at business and business people more than just taxable entities. Now, I think almost all the 1% you talked will say, look, I understand that more taxes are coming my way, and that's the way it goes. But that's not all that the 1% or the business leaders have to offer. They have amazing networks of contacts that can be monetized. And more than that, people owe them favors.
Right.
And so working with them in an intelligent way is something very powerful. And I'll give you an example. In 1941, we produced in this country 3.1 million automobiles. No country in the world came close. But FDR decided in 1941, I can't have Ford Motor making cars and the preceding corporations to General Motors making cars if I'm going to win this war. So he went to Ford and he went to these companies. He said, you're not in the car business anymore. And they said, oh, yes, we are. And he said, oh, no, you're not. And so from 1941 to the end of the war, we did not make 150 cars. We went from 3.1 million to 50 cars a year. The government of the United States is cloaked in immense power.
Except, I got to point this out, the examples you're giving is not so much government power as the patriotism, I think, of those companies. When it did come to push to shove, when Youngstown Sheet and Tube said to Harry Truman, oh, no, we're not turning this over for tanks, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, Youngstown Sheet and Tube won.
They did, and so the patriotism point is a really important one.
Okay.
Because I think what we've lost is the ability to coalesce and align around an idea. The way we did when 15 million or 16 million men and women came home from World War II, and when everybody said, business, government, law, regulators, let's figure out a way to pull together. And we got people cheap housing, and we got cheap cars and great education. We need to have that same sort of alignment. And when we align as a nation, we're very powerful.
Okay, you can persuade a CEO. Let's say that's possible. Guy like yourself, very persuasive, very knowledgeable. You can persuade a CEO onto that program. How do you persuade the shareholders who really don't care?
Okay, here's one thing I would say. Here's the example. Everyone agrees, shareholders, Democrats, Republican, that we once had the greatest infrastructure in the world and it's currently crumbling. And that what we need to do is spend trillions to begin to even measure up, to keep up. So let's agree right here, right now, outside of raising taxes, not a penny of taxes, that we're going to build $1 trillion worth of new infrastructure, and let's get corporations to do it. And everyone agrees that's necessary in order to propel the organism called the United States commercial enterprise
keep this good golden goose going.
Right. So how do we do it? Well, if we're going to raise $1 trillion, and you and Mike can be CEOs, if we're going to raise $1 trillion,
Michael, you can be CEO.
Okay.
I'll be something else.
Okay. What you have to do is, let's say we're going to need 300 billion. We're going to need 300 billion of equity. Okay. What you do is you go to every corporate pension fund, every union pension fund, every public pension fund, and say, we're going to put your people to work. Now is the time to invest in the infrastructure, and we're going to do it together as collectively as a nation. And people who go along will get along, and people who don't will be out of alignment with where the government and the corporations want to go.
Do you buy into that, Michael?
Now, if we had 300 billion, let me just finish the program.
Go ahead.
So that leaves 700 billion. Now, in World War II, we had war bonds.
Right.
I think we should create job bonds. I think we should go to every American citizen and say, now is the time for all good people to come to the aid of your country. Invest now. You will do something. You will create momentum around fixing our infrastructure. You will create great middle-class jobs, those multiplier jobs where one person gets hired and 2 or 3 more. But one more thing that we have not done, you will engage the American people, the American corporations, the American unions in the rebuilding of our infrastructure.
What do you say to the person who says, well, job bonds are debt? We can't take on any more debt.
You know, people said that in World War II, and they took on the debt anyway. This is a Manhattan project.
This is not that generation, Peter. A couple of things to note on what you were saying. I'm not out of alignment with a lot of what you're saying. But here's the rub. What you guys are talking about is the corporate culture, mindset, and reality at a level that I don't think we need to get to first. I don't think you start with the guys that have shareholders, largely because of what Rick said. I think they are brought into this process much later. And I'll give you an example that's a little closer to my home. When I was Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, as I mentioned before, I would talk to these corporations, these business in the state. They weren't the Northrop Grummans and the Under Armours, although Under Armour is an incredible business partner for the state. They were much smaller companies that were hiring 50, 100, 250. Some were in manufacturing, some were not. But this was the rub and the pushback that I got from them. They said their problem was they want to be good corporate citizens. They want to be able to invest in that 5-year-old in her kindergarten. They want to provide, in fact, I had arranged for them to provide computers, to provide resources to a lot of the failing public school systems in the state. You know what the problem was? The government. The problem was teachers' unions. The problem were all these other institutions that had a different interest and were invested differently in the problem that would block that corporate interest from coming to the table. In fact, I had to have some companies take back the computers they donated because the response was, well, if you give to that school system over there, what do we do with the school system over here? And my response was, let's find them a corporate partner. But their reaction was, no, there's none that exist. It's almost like folks saying, well, we can't find any black people to actually do this job in a city full of black people. And that is the problem, is that changing the mindset inside the government institutions, I think first opens up that door to bring corporations into the mix a little bit more willingly, because they are willing to do that. But maybe not at the big end. Let's start small with the neighborhood companies and businesses that are located, that are actually have a direct line of sight of hiring these kids.
I wonder if they have as much capability, though, those small businesses.
Sure they do. I know they do. Absolutely they do. They're hiring people right and left. The problem is they're not allowed to invest in the community the way they'd like to necessarily.
Yeah, I do think that there has to be a new kind of dialogue, whether it's public-private partnerships. I'll cop to all your points. I think they're completely valid. It's hard to do. It's not as easy as it was under FDR. But I will tell you this. The one thing I believe very firmly that you said is that small business is the cradle of job creation. And the last thing you'd ever want to do is increase taxes and prevent them from doing what they do so well. So I think people want to double the capital gains rate are basically missing the entire point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. I actually like your approach better. Rather than try and find more money from these people but by doubling their tax rate, let's enlist them in a jobs bond.
Correct.
Concept. I think that's a much better expenditure of their money, number one. And number two, they'll get a return.
And they'll put the American people back.
And we all get a return.
This is all, a rising tide does lift all boats.
Peter Kiernan, who will be back, I promise you that. Author of American Mojo, Lost and Found. I highly recommend you go out and get it if you are the least bit interested in how we get back our middle class. That's it for tonight, Michael. We will be back tomorrow. This is, of course, Steele and Ungar on Sirius XM POTUS 124.